You're listening to Shaun of the South Live, and that music you hear behind me are the fine boys of Charleston, South Carolina's own Red Cedar Reviewl.
I was in the joint in East Detroit, served a sentence in Dallas, Texas. I got locked up all over trying to get to Oklahoma, and I ain't been back there since. In the slammer in Alabama, and Montana, Savannah, and Atlanta. In the penitentiary down in Memphis, Tennessee, I got a tattoo says I heart mama. Incarcerated in every state, institutionalized along the way. Did I happen to mention that my life of correction started back in juvenile detention? Yeah, my rap sheet's a mile long, but it's not why I sing my song. No, I came here to say there's been a terrible mistake, 'cause I ain't done nothing wrong. I've been arrested for possession of just about everything, from weapons to wild animals. I got breaking and entering, burglary, disorderly, battery, trespassing. These are all just cases of mistaken identity. Charges dropped in St. Louis, picked back up in Kansas City. Paroled in Alabama, probation in Mississippi. I've been detained, retained, and contained in jail, but never missed a court date. I ain't never skipped bail. I'm just a victim of the system, a victim of circumstance. They framed me, set me up, they tampered with evidence. I ain't never done nothing wrong. I would swear on my mother, except for maybe that one time and maybe a couple others. I was in the joint in East Detroit, arrested down in Houston, Texas. Solitary confinement way up in Rhode Island, and I ain't been back there since. In the slammer in Alabama, Montana, Savannah, Atlanta, Nevada, Nebraska. In the penitentiary down in Jackson, Mississippi. Got a tattoo says I heart Steve. Incarcerated in every state, institutionalized in every way. Did I happen to mention that my life of correction started back in after school detention? Yeah, my rap sheet's a mile long, but it's not why I sing my song. No, I came here to say there's been a terrible mistake, 'cause I ain't done nothing wrong. No, I ain't done nothing wrong.
Charleston, South Carolina's own Red Cedar Reviewl. My mother's elderly cousins, Mr. Lonnie and Laurie, were known to everybody as Lonnie and Laurie. And I know you've met them before. They're just like everybody in every small town, every small tiny church, every little community club or organization that you've ever met. They're elderly and they dress alike somehow. She wears her hair in such a way that you look at her and smile because you know that her hair came from a bottle. And Mr. Lonnie wears the same kind of cotton t-shirt with a collar around it, short sleeve with a stripe running across the front, and a front pocket where he keeps his eyeglasses and his notebook. He always takes notes. They've been married since the earth cooled for a long, long time. They've had 3 kids who have grown and left the house, and this is why when you ride by Lonnie and Laurie's house, you will see Mr. Lonnie in the front lawn, no matter what day of the year it is. In fact, I bet you right now, if you were to drive by their house, you would see one of the 2 of them in their front lawn. They worship their front lawn. Mr. Lonnie and Laurie, when they first got married, were like any young couple. Their lives, their central question to their marriage was just like anybody in America, and that's what's for dinner. But once they got a little bit older and they had children, their world revolved around their kids. Everything was about the kids' schedules, the kids' school, the kids' extracurricular activities. It's a hard one to say. And it was Mr. Lonnie who was the most committed to this. Mr. Lonnie was not a type A personality. He's what you call a double A personality. He did everything for everybody all the time. End of the story. He was the kind of man who didn't just show up to the party. He was the kind of man who threw the party, who had a big cylindrical pot on his stove which was boiling over with some kind of chili or stew that he'd made, or out back you would see a barbecue grill and he would be the one cooking. He was the one who coached Little League. He was the one who coached the Pee Wee Football League. He was the one who had the hot dog and chili supper to raise funds for the new uniforms. He's the one who was a Boy Scout leader. He's the one who took them camping. He's the one who fed his family. He's the one who was always behind that stove. Type AA personality. Mr. Lonnie was a good man. A good man. But he had this innate ability to make some of the people in his life somewhat miserable. It wasn't on purpose. It's just that people like Mr. Lonnie, who are so driven, who cannot sit still, who have to be out in their yards working, well, they make some of the people in their life who are lazy a little bit uncomfortable. But Mr. Lonnie was not a type AA person this week. On this particular week, Mr. Lonnie was sick. He had come down with a bad chest infection. It started as a small sniffle. He woke up and he noticed that his nose was completely compacted. And to people like Mr. Lonnie, this doesn't feel unpleasant in as much as it just makes them pissed off. And Mr. Lonnie was angry. He was angry that he was sick. He was angry that he couldn't go out into his lawn and obsess over the very level of his grass, which he kept at least 3/4 of an inch. It was the tightest grass in the neighborhood. And Mr. Lonnie was in his easy chair. And he was wearing one of those t-shirts with the collar and the stripe. And he had his reading glasses. And he was watching the Western Channel. But he wasn't really watching the television in as much as he was complaining about how much they pay for TV and how he flips through channels every day of his cotton-picking life and can't find a single thing to watch. Of course, complaining is another one of the arts that Mr. Lonnie has mastered. He likes the Western Channel, though. He likes John Wayne. He likes the Magnificent Seven. He even doesn't mind it when Dean Martin plays a cowboy. He could watch the Western Channel 24 hours a day, but he watches it at such a high volume that it makes the shingles on the roof begin to rattle. And Miss Laurie came out from her sewing room where she was working on some crafts, and she said, "Lonnie, turn that thing down." But Lonnie could not hear her because Lonnie is half deaf. She's told him at least 100 times she wishes he would get hearing aids. And he swears he never heard her say that. Mr. Lonnie sat on that easy chair and he watched the Westerns and he felt hunger in his belly. And he knew that he had to get up out of that chair, even though he didn't feel like it, and go into that kitchen and cook for himself. Because after all these years of marriage, he knew without a shadow of a doubt, Miss Laurie was not going to cook him a single thing. She was lazy. And it's the same reason why his kids were somewhat lazy. And so he forced himself out of the chair and he hobbled to the kitchen, holding on to the sofa for balance. And Miss Laurie saw him walking and she said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm going to the kitchen to get something to eat so I don't starve my ass to death." And she said, "Well, Lonnie, I was fixing to cook you something." And he said, "Really? Well, where is it?" And she said, "Well, I hadn't gotten started yet." He looked at his watch and he said, "Why, it's 1:30. I hadn't eaten a thing all day." Mr. Lonnie and Miss Laurie, they were quite the couple. In fact, he should have been worried that he was about to starve to death, because it was because of him that daily life even took place. Even his extended family should have been grateful for all the work he put in. Family reunions would not have happened if it wasn't for Mr. Lonnie. Every year, he went to great pains to make sure these family reunions happened. He would organize who was bringing what for food and where it was going to be held, and who was going to be manning the grill, and who was going to be manning the sides and condiments table, and who was going to be taking care of the kids. And it was Mr. Lonnie who who did all of this. Mr. Lonnie was the man who made sure his son had a sports education, or else his son would have just sat in his room and read books and not known a thing about what an infield fly is or an offsides kick. So Mr. Lonnie was the one who brought the boys to and from Little League practice. And Mr. Lonnie was the one who made sure that the boys had something fun to do, even in the off season. And it was Mr. Lonnie who was the one who recruited his next door neighbor, Marty, into helping be his assistant coach. And Marty was one day riding on the tailgate of Mr. Lonnie's truck, and they were in his driveway eating chili dogs, and Mr. Lonnie was backing up his truck while the boys sat on the tailgate. And Marty jumped off the tailgate, and he didn't know that Lonnie had the truck in gear, and Lonnie just kept driving and ran Marty right over. Luckily, by the grace of God, Mr. Marty survived with only 2 broken ribs. He missed a few games after that, and Mr. Lonnie never quit giving him hell about it. Lazy people, this world is nothing but lazy people. Lazy people who are wasteful, and they spend too much money on things they don't need. They're addicted to things, and they're addicted to their laziness. That's how Mr. Lonnie felt. Mr. Lonnie once took his son's Boy Scout troop into the mountains. He was there to guide them and make sure they didn't kill themselves. He ended up taking the troop over that week, even though he was not really supposed to be the troop leader. He was just a volunteer parent. But the troop leader was just such a slacker that Mr. Lonnie was the one who fell naturally into that leadership position. And he was marching them boys all over Mount Cheaha, and they were singing songs which Lonnie was leading. And because of Lonnie, it was such a fun trip. Even the old Boy Scout leaders admitted that much. When Mr. Lonnie got home from that trip, his children and himself had lost a little bit of weight. Mr. Lonnie had lost 4 pounds from all the hiking and all the eating canned food over campfires. When he walked through the door, he almost didn't recognize Miss Laurie. Miss Laurie had lost 10 pounds in the week that he was gone. And he knew why she'd lost that much weight, because his daughter had told him, "Daddy, when you were gone, all Mama made us for dinner was fish sticks and fiber cereal." Mr. Lonnie got sick about a month before his planned family reunion, which he hadn't even gotten to sink his teeth into yet. Normally, this was the time of year when he made all the phone calls, and he coordinated even flight plans with people to make sure everyone could be there. His relatives from Virginia, and even as far away as New York City. He had relatives from Huntsville, relatives from around Montgomery. He made sure that everybody was going to be at the same place and the same time, the childhood home which he grew up in, way out in the sticks. There would be 4 or 5 kids piled up in the old bedrooms. There would be spouses in the den, sleeping on the sofa and in sleeping bags on the floors. And there would be someone sleeping out in the shed in a cot. The men would have a plastic jug full of a clear liquid that was illegal in several counties. And he took great pleasure planning this reunion. But right now, his body was failing him. Over time, he got too weak to even care about what was on the Western Channel. Miss Laurie took him to the doctor. He could hardly believe it. He could hardly believe that his wife had loaded him into the car and taken him to the doctor. And he pumped Mr. Lonnie full of fluids and full of medications and prescriptions. And Mr. Lonnie, for the first time in his entire life, realized there was a sickness that existed that he could not power through. All his life, Mr. Lonnie had gone to work, even though he'd been sick. Work was his profession. Work was his solace. Work was where he felt like he was himself. It was more than a job. And ever since he retired, his world had gone to hell. Mr. Lonnie told the men at the young men's Bible study, "Boys, I hope you never ever retire. I hope you never retire, because retirement is like going to purgatory. You're physically well enough to be able to do some things, but you're too old by the general public's consideration to do other things. You're just in limbo, in this middle ground where you can do nothing. And so Mr. Lonnie worshiped that lawn of his. And it got worse. He got worse until his body felt overheated and warm, and he couldn't even say a single sentence without becoming short of breath. And Miss Laurie worried about him. She fed him fish sticks and Fiber One cereal for supper. And he ate it. He slept in that recliner, and he had strange dreams, the kind of dreams that you have when you're febrile, when you have a hot forehead. And Miss Laurie came out and she would check on him and she would say, "Is there anything I can do?" It was when the ambulance came that he knew things were serious. The paramedics came into the house, and all he has are hazy memories of Miss Laurie standing over him and saying, "Lonnie, talk to me, Lonnie, Lonnie, talk to me." And he couldn't gather the strength to say anything. And the paramedics lifted Mr. Lonnie out of his easy chair. They placed him on a gurney, and they wheeled him through his own front door and through his front lawn. And he looked out at the lawn, and he noticed the grass was long, and it killed him. And they pushed him inside the ambulance, and they shut the door, and he looked around, and he was scared, and he was feeling terror that he'd never felt before. And he saw Miss Laurie beside him, and he reached his hand out. She said, "What is it, Lonnie? What is it?" He said, "Do you know how much an ambulance ride costs?" And they wheeled him to the hospital in a hurry. They pumped him full of more fluids, and they gave him antibiotics. And Miss Laurie looked at the doctor, and she said, "Is he going to be all right?" And they said, he's not looking good. He's older, and his immune system is fighting really hard." And Miss Laurie sat beside his bed day in and day out in that hospital. She knew that their marriage had been a series of ups and downs. She knew that sometimes he was pleased with her, and other times he was just so overworked and so underpaid and so stressed out that anxiety fueled his days. But she loved him. She loved him even though life wasn't as glittery and beautiful as they tell you it's going to be in Hollywood. She read to him. She read children's books, which she was able to find in the front entryway. She had them in a basket, and she had meant to give them to Goodwill at least 10 years ago, but they'd sat there for at least 10 years. And they were the first books she could find when she went home just to shower herself and clean up. And she brought these children's books, and she sat at the bedside beside Mr. Lonnie. And she read these plain-spoken elementary books. And Mr. Lonnie opened his eyes, and in his haste he said, "Can't you read something that's made for grown-ups?" And so she went downstairs to the gift shop, and she found books which were available for checkout, and she brought a few of them up to him. She stirred him from his slumber, and he opened his eyes hazily. He said, What is it?" She said, "I got some books for you." And she opened up the first book, and he said, "What's the name of that one?" She said, This is called The Raptures of Lustful Youth, a Harlequin Romance." And he listened to her read stories about a bare-chested young man with too many muscles sweeping a young and petite female off her feet. And he wanted to laugh, but he couldn't. He didn't have the energy. He has hazy memories of her feeding him chocolate pudding in the hospital. He wanted to open his eyes and say, "After 51 years of marriage, Laurie, you know I hate chocolate pudding." But he didn't say a word, because this woman was not as incapable and incompetent as he thought. She slept in a chair beside his bed, and she was with him every second. And one day, the doctors came in, and they had good news. They said, "Mr. Lonnie, we're giving you the green light to go home. You're looking pretty good." And Miss Laurie broke down and she cried. She touched Mr. Lonnie on his chest, and she buried her face in the folds of his hospital gown, and she wet them with her own salt water. She said, "I love you so much." They placed him in a wheelchair and they rolled him through the white, sterile corridors of the hospital into the elevator. They descended down and into the lobby, and she asked the doctor if it would be possible that she push the wheelchair. And the doctor took his hands off the wheelchair handles and said, "Go ahead." And she pushed the wheelchair to the door. She helped him into the vehicle. They rode home, and Mr. Lonnie didn't have the energy to say much. They loaned her a walker from the hospital with tennis balls on the front feet, and she helped him shuffle along the sidewalk. He was still wearing his flannel pajamas. She helped him up the sidewalk, and he felt like he might give out and quit breathing right there, but he worked and worked. His muscles had atrophied, and his legs felt weaker than they'd ever felt before, especially when walking up those concrete steps. She helped him through the door, and when he reached his own den, it felt nice to lay back into his own easy chair. And she turned on the Western Channel. But he didn't get the chance to fall asleep. She came out from the back bedroom and she held a hanger. And on that hanger was a cotton shirt with a collar and a white stripe and a pocket in front. And there were pressed khakis. He said, "What's that?" She said, "Well, I figured it might be good for you to get into your normal clothes and feel like you were back to normal life instead of stuck in that god-awful hospital. I'm so glad to have you home." He said, "Who ironed my pants?" She said, "Well, that was me." Mr. Lonnie had never known Miss Laurie to iron a thing in her blasted life. He had to teach himself to iron when they first got married. All his life, his mother had done his ironing, but when he married Miss Laurie, she was just so incredibly lazy and so easygoing that she never even touched the iron and had no idea how to use it. She helped him get changed in that living room. She helped him undress, and when he was completely naked, holding on to the sofa for balance while she helped each foot into the legs of the khaki pants. He noted how white his skin was and how flabby and how old he looked. And he said, "I know my body has changed a lot since the day we got married." And she rubbed his back with her cool little hand and she said, "You still look handsome to me, Lonnie." She got him looking nice, and he went back to the chair to sit down, and she said, No, you can't sit down." And she turned off the TV. She walked him to the back door. He said, "Where are we going?" She said, "I just have something I want to show you." She opened the back door with one swing of her hand, and the door flew open. And there in his backyard were 210 people gathered. There were cousins all the way from Huntsville and Virginia and the ones from New York City. His children were there, his grandkids, his nieces, his nephews. Cousins he'd never met before in his life were there. His next door neighbor Marty was there. His old friends were there. The people in his men's Bible study were there. People who'd been on his Little League team were there. There was a grill way over in the corner of the yard smoking, and there was a table full of ribs and cooked chicken. There was a picnic table which was draped in a red and white checkered tablecloth and loaded with potato salad and barbecue beans and sliced tomatoes raw and pickled okra. And Mr. Lonnie felt his breath catching him, and his mouth started to quiver. And Miss Laurie touched his back and she said, "Are you having trouble breathing?" And his eyes were wet. And he thought to himself how much he loved this woman and how unfair he had been to her. How she was a capable mother, and she was sweet, and she was creative, And she'd made their children into creative people who weren't bound by a schedule or by requirements. They were not type AA people. They were good people who had good families. And he cried. And he wiped his tears with his arm. And she held him close. And his eyes opened, and he looked at all the people standing there. An entire family reunion and then some. And he noticed they were standing in his world, in his life that he built with this woman on his grass. And Miss Laurie said to him, "What is it, Lonnie?" He said, "Oh, nothing. I was just going to say, this grass has never looked so bad in all my life." Thanks for listening to Sean of the South. I've been your host, Sean Dietrich, and it has been a pleasure. Hope you join us next week. That music here behind me is Brad Edwardson on the guitar, Aaron Fairtag on the mandolin, the Red Cedar Reviewl from Charleston, South Carolina. To find out anything more about what I do, you can visit SeanoftheSouth.com, and while you're there, I hope you drop me a line, because I love to hear from my friends. And speaking of friends, blessed is he who does not expect much out of life, for he will not be disappointed. Adios.